Hello, welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna Marie and today I'm going to talk to you about the books I read in, what month are we in? June? So it was May. This is May. Yes, it took me a while to get back into it, but I think I've now surpassed the slump and I've made some changes and some decisions about stuff which is helping me to not be so fatigued and stressed, or at least will in the future, and I'm hoping that this will continue as an upward spiral. So the first book that I read was not this book, but it's something in this book. I did also do a bunch of shorter reading, partially as a way to help myself get back into it, and one of the things I had it in my head that I wanted to read for a while. I can't remember exactly what it was that prompted me to be oh, I haven't read that, but basically I've read all of Jane Austen's novels, but I haven't read her some of her smaller stuff, her juvenilia and things like that. I mean, I'm not really that interested in reading her juvenilia, I guess, but I am interested in reading Lady Susan, which is what I did read. I have actually read Sanditon, which is an excerpt from a book that she did not finish because she passed away before she finished it. And I also am wondering if I read the Watsons. If I did, I would have read it from this copy. But yeah, I read Sanditon, I know, because that was on a university course I did, and we read that for it. But yeah, we didn't read Lady Susan, and I hadn't read Lady Susan, and Lady Susan is complete. It's a novella in epistolary form, so it's all contained in letters between various characters, and yeah, it's quite fun. It's obviously slight in a way that a Jane Austen book isn't really, because it's not novella length, you can really get into and invested in the characters, and because it's not epistolary, you get definitely more interior contact with them in a way that obviously these letters don't. But that's part of the sort of joy of the form and the exploration in the story, because basically Lady Susan is about a fairly cruel and manipulative, conniving woman called Lady Susan, who's very beautiful and sort of mostly able to charm people and manipulate her way out of difficult situations for her. And she has a poor child, and it kind of starts when she's maybe started some kind of what's the word, scandal at a friend's house with the husband of the woman who lives there. The Manwarings, I believe. I think I heard some people say Mannering, but it's spelt man-wearing. I don't know if, yeah, you don't say that. You say Mannering instead. Maybe it's a classic Cholmondeley situation. And so it starts with her asking to stay with a family member, or a sister-in-law, I think, or maybe, yes, some kind of family relation through in-laws. And it kind of goes from there, and we listen. We don't have every single letter exchange, clearly, because there are definitely gaps, but we do have and sometimes there's references to I got your letter of blah blah blah, which is a letter we haven't read, but generally we get we can piece together things by following various different correspondences. And yeah, it is enjoyable, and it's definitely very Jane Austen-y, quite kind of arch, and at times a little bit maybe socially cruel in a way, or very socially, I want to say pert, but I don't think I really mean that. But yeah, so yeah, it was nice to read something new from Jane Austen that I hadn't read before. I should have maybe waited until Jane Austen July, but I just wanted to read it now, so I did. The next book I read was a reread, which I read pretty fast, but it's because I listened to it, and that's The Secret History by Donna Tartt. A friend of mine recently read this, and we had been talking about it, and we'd been talking, and they enjoyed it much more than I did when I first read it, and it just kind of made me want to reread it. So I did, and I would say none of my sort of major feelings or opinions changed about it, but I do think I probably enjoyed it a little bit more on the reread, because there wasn't the weight of oh, interacting with this big books, that big book that's culturally quite important, or not even really important, but just very kind of praised and discussed, and obviously quite influential. So yeah, but I wouldn't say that I changed my feelings about it really. I think it's fine, but I did enjoy rereading it, and it was yeah, it was nice to kind of reacquaint myself with stuff, so that now I remember it a little bit better than I did. The next book I read, a little bit with this, was not the whole collection of work in this, but just the titular one, which is The Blazing World, which I think is what fictionally Margaret Cavendish is the most kind of well known for. the description of a new world called the Blazing World, written by the thrice noble, illustrious and excellent princess, the Duchess of Newcastle. This is a work from, I think, 1666, I want to say, like 1660s. There's other stuff in this collection, which, I mean, don't sound totally uninteresting to me, but I just, like, I'm not going to read them, or at least not any time right now, you know? So this is, like, kind of lauded as one of the first, if not the first, like, science fiction novels. And it's very, like, early in that sense, in both senses, science and also novels. But it was intriguing to read. I do kind of feel like at a point, some of it you just, like, glaze over. There's, like, a whole section where, you know, it's about this woman who basically finds, and it's, like, led into a new world, and she, like, meets the empress, and she meets the emperor, and she becomes the empress there. And there are various, like, creature men combos, you know, like bear men, they who, like, greet her first, ant men, what else, you know, like other, like, sort of insecty ones, and then also foxmen. I remember foxmen. And there's points where it's just really long drawn out conversations between this empress and those various men who are in various groups, like part of particular studies of, like, science, nature, I don't know, like elements, like the earth, like this kind of thing. So there's lots of conversations and questions of, like, so what is this in the sky? Like, how can particles continue to move in the world? Or, like, how does the wind work? And what is lightning? And things like that. So in that sense, it's very interesting from a kind of, like, this is clearly a point, you know, the early modern era is clearly a point when kind of science itself is becoming, like, codified into an actual framework of, or like an actual way to produce knowledge, like the scientific method, discovery, discussion, questioning the boundaries of, like, knowledge in the world, and also in terms of, like, religious practices too, and maybe, like, butting up against some of, like, religious doctrine that just, like, accepts the world as being created by God, and that's the kind of final say on questions of, like, matter and atoms and the sky and the stars and things like that. So I think, like, if you can take it from, like, a broad perspective, it's quite interesting. But if you are in it for, like, a granular story kind of way, it's not interesting. At least that's how I feel. I did feel like I really benefited from reading this, having read a few of the poems. And, like, last year I was a teaching assistant on a early modern literature course, and I got to read some of the poems and, like, learn about some of the poems of Hester Poulter, who was a really interesting, like, poet and writer, and she was writing around the same time as Margaret Cavendish. I can't remember her exact dates, but I also do, like, another kind of aspect of Margaret Cavendish that's interesting is that she was a monarchist during a time of civil war, and so I think her husband was actively, directly involved. I actually said monarchist, I mean royalist, but either way, she was a monarchist. And I think her husband was maybe directly involved, so she had to flee with her family, England, and wrote some of the things abroad, maybe in Amsterdam or something. But there are definitely points in The Blazing World where she's definitely taking, like, a really particular kind of aim at parliamentarians and the idea of a commonwealth. I think at one point she, like, the empress in the story is just like, I see that you have an emperor, like, so clearly you like monarchies. And they're like, yes, of course, because a commonwealth is like a monster, it has too many heads, something like that, which is just kind of funny. Yes, I lost what I was saying. I think I was talking about Hester Poulter, actually, because, yeah, basically Hester Poulter was also a royalist around the same time, writing around the same time, and was also very interested in, like, also was a woman writer, very interested in, like, new knowledges, and in particular kind of, like, well, just, like, science in general, but in particular maybe, you know, the skies and stars and things like that. And I just thought it was really interesting and fascinating to have read her work, her poetry, which was discovered in the 1990s in this one manuscript in, I think, Leeds University Library or something like that. I'll leave a link to, like, where you can check out more of her work, because there's a whole, like, Hester Poulter project where you can see all of her poems in that manuscript, both, like, facsimile, like, pictures of them, and also transcribed, because it's much easier to read. And yeah, and I also just thought it was really interesting to think about the kind of links between how they were employing, like, the female voice and female speaker, and constructing the identity of the woman speaker and their own position too, because Margaret Cavendish appears in the Blazing World as a kind of scribe to the Empress, who is like looking for help with something. There's some strange, I'm not quite sure. There was a whole kind of interlude bit with like reference to Kabbalah, and I don't really understand particularly how that was being like used or what it exactly meant in that context. But you know, that's fine, we're moving on. I definitely don't understand everything that happened in here or was discussed, but I really don't need to. But you know, there's also these questions of like spirituality too, and like, yeah, the nature of the universe kind of thing, and non-entities. So again, like just really quite interesting if you take a bigger picture, just not that interesting to have read directly. There's a few more things I wanted to say. I feel like, I hope it's okay to keep talking about it, even though I'm a bit like, this was boring, but it's also, I mean, it isn't very long, so I would recommend it for that. Like, yes, what I wanted to talk about is, so not only does Margaret Cavendish like appear in this, she's also doing a form of like soul traveling with the Empress at some points, and there is like a very, they decide basically and like explicitly state that they're like platonic soulmates, and that's very interesting, you know? It's very gay and it's very interesting. And even at one point, the two souls of the Empress and also Margaret, the scribe in the text, they go on a little adventure into like her world, like our world. And they go to Margaret Cavendish's husband, and then the Empress goes into his body, like her soul goes into his body, and the Margaret soul feels left out, so she also goes into his body. And so the three souls kind of there in this triad, this like polyamorous triad, which is just, yeah, very interesting. She must have been like pretty like kooky and interesting woman. She does also sort of like, the character of Margaret Cavendish in the text does talk about wanting to be famous, basically, I think. And I think that Margaret Cavendish outside of the text also said this. And, you know, I guess that's true considering I'm reading her book like 500 years later. 400. The Empress, that she like ultimately does a lot of very like sort of horrible colonial violent stuff using the forces that she's like uncovered, and then can kind of manipulate to her own desires in the Blazing World that she finds. You know, from that perspective, it's very like clearly involved in both conflict and war in terms of Civil War stuff, but also just colonialism and the kind of like environment of that at the time too. I think that they use the phrase like the kingdoms of Ireland, France, Scotland and England, like she becomes like the queen of ISFE or something like that. I'm really glad that I read it. I did like tab a lot of the pages, which I guess I should go back through and like maybe underline a few things. Somebody else this was a secondhand copy, so somebody else had already been there and underlined some things, which was sometimes fun to see, and also sometimes I was like, that's boring, why did you underline that? Oh my gosh, here's a list of some of the men that she encounters, the Empress. Some bird men, some fly men, some ant men, some geese men, some spider men, some lice men, some fox men, some ape men, some jackdaw men, some magpie men, some parrot men, some satyrs, some giants, and many more which I cannot all remember. And of these several sorts of men, each followed such a profession as was most proper for the nature of their species. I think that does give you an insight into how it's written at points. This was one of the books that I wanted to get to this year, so I'm really happy to have done that. The final book that I finished in May, but I am going to talk about when I finished in June, because I finished it like the 3rd or the 2nd day of June. But this was, I finished in May, and that is I Was a Child of Holocaust Survivors by Bernice Eisenstein. Like, this is one of the books that I bought this year, and I actually bought it at the beginning of this year. It just took a while to get to it, because I was looking at books that I loved last year and thinking about like the themes and why, and I particularly love like graphic works of non-fiction, and so I was like looking for more, and I read this book, Heavyweight by Solomon J. Brager, which I've talked about a lot, so but this is about the Holocaust and memory, and it's really good and really interesting. And it is a graphic work of non-fiction. It's a graphic kind of biography, family history, family memoir. And obviously the Nazi Holocaust in particular, I guess, has kind of like a legacy of being involved in graphic works of non-fiction, partially because of the like incredible success of Art Spiegelman's Mouse trilogy, Mouse series, which I have read, but quite a long time ago, but I have read that. So I think it kind of burgeoned or helped to like facilitate more of that kind of genre. And anyway, but this was like a book that I found through kind of searching and looking at lists of like interesting like Jewish nonfiction graphic stuff. I think this came out maybe in 2007 or something. This was like quite interesting to me. I feel like I felt that it was a little bit frustrating at points. I also felt it was quite refreshing in a way. And yeah, I don't know, let's see how I can talk about this. So, I Was the Child of Holocaust Survivors is exactly as it sounds, about a woman who grows up and knows that her parents were survivors of the Holocaust. It is less graphic than I actually thought it was going to be. There are like drawings, but there's more text than I thought. There is like one kind of section here where it becomes like comic-y. But the rest of it is not like that. So that was something that I didn't realise until I started reading it, but that was fine. And yeah, basically, what should I say? I think like, so it's trying to grapple with the experiences of like her two parents. And in doing so, you know, grapple with the kind of like violence and pain and trauma of the Holocaust. In a way, it's very solipsistic. Like, it's about her though. Like, even though it's sort of supposed to be about like, in some way, her parents and their lives, it's very much about her and her own feelings about that. Or at least that's where we begin. Because we kind of begin with her being like, I was obsessed with being the child of Holocaust survivors. I would be like, you can't be mean to me, my parents are Holocaust survivors. Like, and then just being like very sort of toxically involved and fascinated in the Holocaust, which I think, considering, I think is quite a sort of relatable human response to acts of violence and mass acts of violence that like we don't necessarily all have the same proximity to. Like, I'm thinking about people's like engagement with true crime narratives and their like obsession with like horribly like brutal misogynistic murder, and a lot of women being very into that, even if that is surely a fraught and complex thing to kind of make into a spectacle. And it's not quite like that level. I don't think those two things are like exactly the same or anything. I just think that sometimes, I think we're trying to search for narratives about violence that are comforting, but also open up those conversations and maybe like help us to feel what it's like to have experienced that kind of violence. And we have to sometimes conclude that actually no amount of my own curiosity or my own kind of gaze on this is going to mean that I know what it feels like, and I have to be okay with that. And then adding in like a parental relationship where you want to connect with your family and with your parents, I can imagine is quite tough. And I think like this book is sort of trying to do some of that. I do think the way that it concluded kind of annoyed me the most, because I felt like, well, her parents did share. Like, she does know, like, she can't ever like feel or literally be walking along beside them as they're being treated horribly in Auschwitz or sent to Bergen-Belsen, but like, she can talk to them, she can share her own life and listen to their feelings. And then in particular, like, her mother literally was recorded giving like her own testimony and experience of her survival of the Holocaust. So she even has that tape, which I think she like transcribes the whole thing in this, so we get to read it too, which I really appreciated. I think without that, it would have also felt like even sort of more strange. Which I feel like I'm being very judgmental now, but I think this is like a really genuine and, like I said, quite refreshing engagement with experiences of the Holocaust. There is like inclusion of like Yiddish stuff, partially because her family was from Poland and they spoke Yiddish, and when they migrated to Toronto, I think it was, but like Canada definitely, like, you know, they continued to speak Yiddish amongst themselves, and like Yiddish and English mixed together, and also had friends who were also from like Poland and had also experienced like being in Auschwitz or other concentration camps and things like that. So that was really nice. There's also like a funny section which was like talking about when her parents would host like a Passover Seder, and some years it would be like shorter, and her dad would like be less mean about the Egyptians in the Passover story because there would be the playoffs on, and so he would have to rush upstairs to watch the hockey. Which was just very sweet. I'm not sure that I particularly liked the art style, and I do think it was a bit fragmented and kind of all over the place, but in a way that was sort of clearly part of the way that Bernice Eisenstein wanted to tell the story and to kind of to show herself visiting memory and returning and like trying to bridge some of those like memorial gaps in a way, or the distances I mean between like her parents in the here and now, or like then when she was writing this and in the past when they were like living in Poland in the 1940s. I feel like I've kind of butchered talking about this, so I'm sorry, but hopefully I made some modicum of sense. I think if you're looking for this kind of book, then you should try this one. You know, like if you're interested in reading more about the Nazi Holocaust, and the experiences of people, both survivors and then also I guess like the families of those survivors, and how they like pass being part of a family of Holocaust survivors, then I would recommend this. Like I gave this 4 stars, like I don't think this is bad, but I just also feel like this is very specific and I was looking to it for a specific thing. Like I wouldn't just recommend someone randomly picks it up. And I do think that if you want to read like maybe a slightly more kind of not necessarily comprehensive, it's also not, you know, it's also filtered through a familial lens, but certainly maybe a like more rigorous and more like historical like book, then I would, like I've said many times before, recommend Heavyweight instead. But yeah, the final book I wanted to then talk about today, because like I just feel like silly to wait until the end of the month to talk about this when I finished it so early in the month, is The Witch of Edmonton by Thomas Dekker, John Ford and William Rowley. And it's also because I read this, like, I think I started this in March or something. It took me ages to actually read, but I finally picked it up and was like, I'm going to finish it. And also I will say that something that really helped me is Beyond Shakespeare is like a kind of, I don't really know exactly what they are, but like an organisation that do like basically like non-Shakespeare early modern plays. They kind of do like amateur just read-throughs on YouTube. Yeah, so they do like a lot. There are a lot of plays, so that are like not Shakespeare. And so they actually had a well, they actually had 2. They had like a first look at The Witch of Edmonton, and then they had a second look of The Witch of Edmonton that actually was published like maybe like 2-3 weeks ago or something, and I was like, oh, and it appeared like in my subscription feed, and I was like, oh, this is a really great like impetus to get back into it. So I watched the second look through, I think, to where I had got up to reading, and then I kept going a little bit, and then that helped me get back into it. And then I did a bit of like reading, watching at the same time, which I always quite like, especially with a play, because I mean plays are supposed to be performed. So I've talked about this a bunch, so I guess I won't say super lots about it, but it's a play also from the 1600s. What was it, like 1616 or something? It's based on like a true life story. I mean, this is sort of a true crime play in a sense, because it takes the like real story, or like, you know, it's about a woman being accused of witchcraft, so you know, I guess it depends on like how much you think that's true, but obviously like materially it happened as a legal case, and in terms of a community, it takes this woman, Elizabeth Sawyer, Mother Sawyer, in Edmonton, who was the Witch of Edmonton, and makes a play about it. I would say it's really interesting in that sense because it's, well, in a way it's kind of clumsy and messy, because it feels like some of the play is very skeptical. Some of the characters are also very skeptical about witchcraft itself, like the Witch of Edmonton being a real thing, a real person. And at the same time, like, it's a play about a woman who is a witch, is called a witch, sort of denies she's a witch, also kind of says she is a witch at points. And then there's also this like really interesting relationship in the play with her familiar, which obviously is quite like a witchy thing to have, a familiar, but the familiar is a dog, like a demonic dog, and the dog's kind of own presence and own agency is quite interesting, and therefore, yeah, some of the kind of ideas around like superstition and legality and just witchcraft in general and women is interesting. And I also think this play is really, really interested in sort of economies, like economies of gender, and then also just class as well, because it's very clear that like it's not just sort of women who are precarious and who have or experience violence, it's also men who can't control and or, like who don't have the same agency as like upper class men do in their lives. Well, that's the other reason why it's a little bit, it's kind of like unsyncopated, like there are like sort of 2 plots and they do kind of coalesce, but at the same time, considering the play is called The Witch of Edmonton, you would think that Mother Sawyer is like a key pivotal kind of center point, but I don't know that she really is. Basically, yeah, the 2 kind of plots and it's the dog that really like traverses and like interconnects them, you know, his actions and he like rubs people and then they do things, and that's also really fascinating to me. I think there's a lot in this play about like intimacy and contact and the fear of like, yeah, what like intimacy and what different kinds of touch can do, and like that's interesting. So the play kind of follows Mother Sawyer, who begins by being like, everybody is calling me a witch, like what have I done to like justify this? Is it just because I'm a poor like withered old woman who's poor? You know, and so again that like skepticism about witches is really fascinating there, and the social constructedness of like a witch is obviously on show. And then the other kind of aspect of the story is about Frank Thorny, who marries a woman called Winifred, who is pregnant with her employer's child, and they get married, and then Frank, in order to please his father and not to get cut off from his inheritance, you know, he has to marry a woman called Susan, and he does do that to please his father and so on. So he's like a bigamist slash, I guess the second marriage just doesn't count and it's just adultery. And it's about, yeah, him and the consequences of his actions. And with the Mother Sawyer plot, it's a bit more kind of like, to be honest, a bit more like rambunctious and a little bit like clownish, where she's like trying to get revenge on old Banks, who's constantly cruel and trying to like beat her basically, and so she wants to hurt his son, I think, young Cuddy Banks. Yeah, it was really interesting to read. It was silly to have read it over such a long period of time. I would love to see it like on stage one day, in particular because I would just be really fascinated to see like how the scenes with the dog happen, because it's not just whilst there are sometimes very specific described actions that the dog does, like the rub, which basically fills Frank, or pretend, well, I guess it really depends on how you take it, because it's like maybe he does nothing and Frank wanted to do this and he just feels emboldened now. The idea is that this interaction with this dog, like it means that basically Frank goes into like a homicidal rage and kills Susan. And there's like other things where it's like the dog is doing this, but then it's sort of like, is the dog doing this, or is this about being scared about the agency of the people who are in community with you? Like, I was actually going to say something else than that, I think, and I've forgotten what it was. Oh yeah, I was just saying, like, I think I would love to see the scenes with the dog. Just me constantly talking about this, sorry. But because like the dog does speak, like not only does the dog have particular like behaviors and things, it literally actively speaks. When it finds Mother Sawyer, it says, "What ho have I caught thee cursing?" It interacts with Cuddy Banks. First of all by like sending like spirits in the shape of the woman he's in love with, which I think is Susan, I can't remember though. And then he does also talk to Cuddy, and then like Cuddy kind of tries in the end. Yeah, I don't know. When I watched the Beyond Shakespeare for the like the second part of it, they talked in the end, and there was one of the people, I think it was the person who played the witch, she talked about like the theological economy of this and like what your soul becomes worth, and I really liked what she had to say, and I also thought she did a good job as the witch. Okay, I think I've nattered long enough on this, so I will stop there. This is like such a random like mishmash of books that I've read, but definitely do let me know if you've read any of them and your thoughts on them, and if you agree or disagree with me. Yeah, I'd actually be really intrigued if there are people who have familial connections with like Holocaust survivors who would read this and like maybe feel like it reflects their own experience or not. I would love to hear from you if that's the case and you have read this or are interested. But yeah, I think that's everything I had to share. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, and I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye!